Hi, Fungayi.
Hello.
Welcome to the Neurodiversum podcast.
No, thank you, Fabian, for having me.
So, we met at the European Autism Conference in Dublin just a couple of weeks ago. And I already did talk to you a little bit right there on the spot. And I really wanted to have you again to give a little more time to your work. And so, first, tell me a little bit about yourself. So, you're originally from Zimbabwe, right?
Yes, I was born in Zimbabwe and grew up in Zimbabwe. So most of my schooling was done in Zimbabwe,
Mm-hmm.
including my first degree, as it were, which was
Mm-hmm.
like in agricultural engineering. I then moved to the UK initially to do postgraduate studies, which were related to agricultural engineering. And since then, I settled in the UK and have been here for half of my life, really, you know.
Where in the UK are you located?
Oh, I live in Birmingham. I live in
Birmingham.
Birmingham,
Okay.
UK, yes.
Okay, so help me out. I'm really bad with geography. Birmingham is kind of like in the middle of England, isn't it?
Yes, it's in the Midlands. It's in where what we call the West Midlands. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's more or less in the middle of the country. Yes.
Okay, so when I'm thinking of the island, it's kind of like in the middle, but a bit to the left.
Let me get my directions right. Yes, I think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, because it's to the west, yes, so it should be towards the left, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And so you were about 25 when you came to the UK, right?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was.
Okay. And so your initial motivation was to enrich your knowledge about agricultural engineering and study that subject field, right?
Yes, that was my initial motivation for coming here.
And um, then you kind of shifted into social work. How did that happen? Did you finish the agricultural studies?
Yes, I did finish the agriculture and I did finish the master's that I was
Mm-hmm.
doing. And so when I finished, uh, I started looking, I was looking for employment really
Mm-hmm.
that was related to my field, or possibly to look at doing a PhD or something further in that field.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, I then had to find work to do, I guess. And that's when I started working like in social care initially as
Mm-hmm.
something that was temporary. As I was working within social care, I had this idea of I wanted to become like a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know how it works in Germany, but here there's social work and there's social care. But I initially wanted to become a social. In fact, what happened was after I finished doing my master's and I was still looking around, I thought to myself, I want to change over to social work because my father was a
Mm-hmm.
social worker. And I went to a university, got an interview, and they said we could offer you a place, but it has to be deferred because you've got no experience of ever working with
Mm-hmm.
people. Because I really didn't have that experience of working with people in those kind of environments.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I came into social care. It is a way to try and get into social work. So my
Oh,
initial
so is it kind of like social care is the lower level where you don't necessarily have some kind of job education, and social work is the higher level where you have like an
so
education or maybe even a university education?
so social care is more like working within the support services.
Mm-hmm.
So like a support worker, a carer, or where
Mm-hmm.
you're doing domiciliary care. So that doesn't necessarily need um, the qualification like as a social worker, because the social worker, you're doing more of the statutory duties.
Mm-hmm.
So you're making more of those statutory decisions. But in social care, we are more or less just supporting people on a day-to-day basis.
So a
And
social carer would be someone who actually works one to one with a person, and a
yeah,
social worker would be like a team leader that.
so a social worker will be separate. So
Mm-hmm.
like if I give you an example, so in the UK, for certain people, they have to get like additional funding
Mm-hmm.
to to able to pay for the care that they receive, and the people who do the assessments to determine that this person has got needs that qualify for that person to be funded will be a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And the social worker will also look at what is a suitable placement for someone in terms of based on their needs. And usually, let's say if it's around learning disabilities and autism, it will be someone with higher support needs that probably is going to need social workers to put that kind of funding in place for them. So that's what a social worker is doing. So they are not doing like the day-to-day support for someone. They're doing more like almost like the bureaucratic end of things on behalf of the government and on behalf of the council to do those kind of assessments. But now in social care, you've got the services which are running on a day-to-day basis. They've got managers, they've got people working in there, but their work is like front-facing. It's on a day-to-day basis. They're helping people meet their daily needs, to ensure people are going for appointments if they need appointments, personal care if it's that kind of a service, all the different things that people need on a day-to-day basis, depending on their level of support. So I hope that kind of gives a bit of...
Yeah.
So I think so I think the university's idea was if I knew the kind of services that eventually I'll be assessing people to go into and having that experience of actually working with people, because coming from Zimbabwe, I hadn't at all come across this kind of services or worked with people with a learning disability. My background was really in agricultural engineering. So I knew agriculture, I knew engineering, but I didn't know working with people. Even as much as my father was like a social worker, my mom was a midwife, but it's a totally different kind of scenario. So what then happened is I went into social care, and my idea was to be exposed to as many types of services as possible. So I worked in every type of service, like homelessness, what we call register services, which are where people need personal care, where they need care with every bit of their daily lives. And then I worked also in what we then call support services, which is more like supported accommodation. So the first services I initially worked with were people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. And I also then worked in an autism unit which housed about 6 young men. And they had what at that time they used to call like behavioral difficulties. So they needed 24-hour support, and sometimes it was 2-to-1. And it was something that was totally new for me. But for me, for some reason, it sparked something in me. It became like something I became passionate about. So the choice then that was there was for me to look at it. Do I still want to go into social work? Because social work to me appeared like you were not going to be working with people on a day-to-day basis. I enjoyed the day-to-day support, the day-to-day work I was doing. So I made that decision to then stay within social care, just working. And I was working in different types of services. Eventually, I became a manager for a support service, like supported living for people with learning disabilities and with autism, just a small unit. That was my initial thing for me when I became a manager. I then went on from there to manage like substance misuse services as well, and services for people who were offenders, who were coming out of prison. And throughout that time, one of the continuing thread that I kept on coming across was autistic people were being failed by these services. So you found people who ended up in the criminal justice system because they just didn't get the right support at the right time. And after doing that for a while,
Can you give an example of a case?
So
where someone got in trouble with the law because of their autism?
So I'll give you one example of someone that we came across, that we supported some time ago. He was a young man who, I think he found himself very lonely, if I were to put it that way, very socially isolated. And his world became very much online. at the time. He was living with his grandparents. His world became very much online. He was like around 18. And at the time, he started a friendship with a girl who was like 15 online. And this was the one person that he was constantly like talking to. But in the process of talking to that girl, some inappropriate things were then said. And he eventually came to the attention of the police. I think there was also an exchange of inappropriate material, if I were to put it that way. So he got arrested, and he couldn't quite understand as to why this was happening to him. But he was then given more like a community order. He could still stay with his grandparents, but he had this thing put on him that he couldn't contact people where, yeah, he couldn't do this, he couldn't do that. Unfortunately, it came out in the press, and the neighbors became aware of it. And it became like quite a big thing for the neighbors, and they were viewing him in a particular way as someone who was looking to abuse young children or whatever. But I don't think that was necessarily his motivation, as it were. So he was referred to us because we ran like some supported accommodation too. So we were able to provide him with support for him to move away from where he was living with his grandparents, because it had become unsafe, into supported accommodation, to start then working with him towards getting a better understanding of what had happened, for him to also build his skills for him to live alone. At that time, they had put an order that he couldn't use a computer anymore without supervision.
What?
Yes. So it's quite a few years ago. So I hope now things have changed and they wouldn't do something like that.
From what I'm hearing and reading about England, it's gotten a lot worse. It's just amazing that they would be like, no, you cannot no longer use a computer. It seems a bit far-reaching.
Yeah, it kind of narrowed his options, as it were, in life, because you can imagine what course are you going to do where who's going to be sitting with you all the time?
Especially when you're a young autistic adult who doesn't have the skill set to have social relations in real life, and then they take away a computer. That's harsh.
Yeah, it was quite. But we worked with him for approximately 2 years, and it's got a happy ending in terms of the story, because he did manage to build a community around himself of other young people that we're supporting. He was able to go back to college, and we managed to work with his probation officer to get those to get the restrictions lifted from him, for him to start going to college. It was quite clear, because even in their judgment, they say they didn't feel he was a risk to people, but they still put in those harsh things, and to build his confidence, for him to see like there's nothing wrong with me. It took a while.
Yeah.
So it came out. It eventually worked quite well for him. But what I would say is an ongoing theme in all these things has always been the lack of understanding.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The lack of understanding, the extent that at that time I had a colleague who lived somewhere towards the area where we were settling the young men, and not a colleague working in our team, but working somewhere else in another part. And she was worried about someone like that moving into an area that she lived in, because all she could see was what this young man had been accused of. And she thought, well, are we safe? Are we? But I would also like to say, as she got to know him, because she was like a housing officer, so had to meet him, she realized that what's written on paper and the person you actually get to meet are two very different things. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I think, like, for all kinds of children, adolescents, and young adults, the laws around exchanging messages can be quite detrimental. Like, let's say you are an 18-year-old and you're in a relationship with a 17-year-old, and the two of you exchange nudes. That could be enough to say place you in jail, depending on what country you're in.
Yeah. It can be quite difficult. And I think you would think to yourself, that young man, he's made I guess, a genuine error in judgment.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't have defined him. The neighbors seem to think that it should,
Mm-hmm.
because based on ignorance as well, because we were getting things like, oh, if someone is autistic, they become obsessed, and that's going to be his one interest. That's one thing he's chasing. So you're not
Oh,
only
okay.
supporting people, you're not only supporting the people that are accessing the services, it's also about looking at the community as well
Mm-hmm.
and trying to get people to understand that better. And I would like to think, I would like to hope it's getting better, but I don't know if it's getting any better,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that's also part of the reason why eventually I ended up then going back to school and getting a qualification, going back to university and doing a master's in autism, because I could see that I was working in these services, and I was doing this work on a practical day-to-day basis, but I felt like we could do something a bit different. We could do things a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm going to do something, I need to have the basis to truly understand what it is that we're doing. How do I justify the approaches we're taking if I don't fully understand
Mm-hmm.
exactly? Yeah. So that was like completely the turn then that I took, and I've been doing this now for
Mm-hmm.
over 20 years. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. And so you eventually worked your way up from just a basic social care worker
Yeah. A social care worker.
to management, and then you went into research as well. Is that correct?
Yes, so I've worked. So eventually, I became like an area manager. So it means I oversee services across a few regions.
Mm-hmm.
Work for quite a big an organization with services across different regions, and also I then eventually looked at going back to university and to become a postgraduate researcher, which I'm doing now, like doing my PhD now on a part-time basis whilst I continue to work. But it's also, my motivation has always been, as I said earlier, about getting better services,
Mm-hmm.
and how we can influence and have research that is meaningful and that has got an actual practical application. So my whole idea why I ended up going back to then do the PhD was looking at the services that are delivered. They are very much designed with a very narrow focus of the people that they are likely to provide support for.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in the UK. So the services are very much designed according to the Western ideals of what independence is,
Mm-hmm.
according to what adulthood is, transition, and all those things. But we find increasingly the people that we are supporting come from different communities, and we are quite often sometimes trying to fit people to fit into the service rather than fitting the services around people.
Mm-hmm.
So my idea is to then start looking at, I've got this passion for parts of the autistic population that are least heard and are least seen. So it's not just around ethnicity, culture. It's also about people. When we look at things like how people express their gender, around sexuality, and so on, we don't always get it right, I feel, in the services that we are providing. So my
Mm-hmm.
idea has always been to then look now, the next stage for my life has been to see if I can do that kind of research with populations that are not necessarily being heard from, and that whose needs are not currently necessarily being met in the services. Yeah.
Okay, someone just came into the room.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
But I didn't have to say anything. Um, okay. Um, and I was wondering, when was the first time that you ever got introduced to autism? Because, I mean, for most people, it's kind of like a niche thing, like, and they don't necessarily know someone who's autistic, but you must have you must have picked up on it at some point. So was that doing your work as a social care worker, or was there something earlier in your life where you...
So I think before I went into social care, my only awareness of like autism was probably a depiction on film. I think was
Mhm.
it Rain Man or
Oh
something?
yeah, yeah, Rain Man.
Yeah, one of
It's always
those
the first thing that comes to mind.
one of those kind of movies.
Hmm.
But in my head, it just didn't necessarily register as such for me to
Hmm.
understand. Because growing up, I had never heard the word autism. I'll be quite honest, or come
Hmm.
across someone that will be probably considered as or anyone who had who was someone could say, "Oh, that's an autistic person." Obviously, sometimes when I look back, I can see some people and say, "Oh, maybe they were," but there was nothing like that. But yes, when I went into social care, was the first time that I was introduced to. I became fully aware now of what autism is, and I don't. I think when you start, I was working in what the in care homes at that time. And
Hmm.
like I said, so people had profound disabilities. So I didn't necessarily see just how heterogeneous autism was. I was initially introduced to a very narrow population of autistic people. But in time, as I worked in different services, I became aware now, and it became like I became more aware. And what I would say is probably it's been a continuing journey because what I was learning and understanding when I did my master's over 10 years ago, my master's in autism, to what is being discussed and what I'm learning now is different, is actually there's been a lot of advance. So it's been a continuous journey of
Hmm.
learning that I've been on. So I still think it's still early parts of my journey, to be honest. There's still a lot more for me to learn. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I did some migrating myself. I mean,
Okay.
it's not that wild. I went from Germany to Switzerland, so
Okay.
I'd say that's not to be compared to Zimbabwe to
To the
England.
UK. Yeah.
But I was wondering, um, like one of the things that comes to mind, and that's also where the word autism comes from, is like someone in their own world. And I wonder, when you first came to England and the situation that you found yourself in, being a stranger to the culture, um, can you relate to some aspects of autism in that regard, being on the outside, maybe not being able to make sense of everything right away? Like, is that relatable to you in that regard?
Yes, I think yeah, I think that's if I understand you right, because I found myself obviously coming as someone who my culture,
Mm-hmm.
my understanding of how to do things was obviously different from how things were done here. There is also like a level of exclusion. So if I
Mm-hmm.
give you an example, if you come here and you are educated, I had like a degree from where I was coming from. I did a master's here. I looked and there were jobs that probably with the master's that I had done in this country, I would qualify for. But they would look at it and say to me, but your first degree was not in the UK. You are not necessarily. So there's a level of exclusion that
Mm-hmm.
you can experience. So I've experienced that exclusion where someone, because you are from a different background, you do not necessarily belong. It's also and this idea, I think even now having lived here a while, it's almost I'll give an example probably related to maybe someone from let's say my background. who is like autistic as like a Black person, if they were to be amongst us, like, within my culture, they'll probably be seen as different because of the way that they do their things. And amongst the autistic population, which is mostly white, they might also still feel like they're different and they don't quite belong. With myself, I've lived in this country now for a long time, but the way things work out, I'm always like a Zimbabwean. I'm always this Black African guy from outside of half my life I've lived here, but I'm still very much viewed as an immigrant, as an outsider in a sense sometimes in certain situations.
Yeah,
But when I go back home, if I go back home, I'm now seen as someone who's been away for a long time. Yeah, so you don't quite also belong to what is supposed to be your own tribe. So I'm almost like too Zimbabwean to be British and too British to be Zimbabwean, and somewhere caught in the middle. If that makes so my
yeah,
identity.
that makes a lot of sense. I mean, in
Yeah,
Germany, one of the most prominent groups that came are the Turkish workers that came
yeah,
in the 60s. And so then you had the first generation of their kids being born in Germany, and they will tell the exact same story that you tell. When they go to Turkey to visit their relatives, they're a stranger there.
yeah,
But when they're in Germany, they still don't fully belong because, I mean, the Turkish look isn't as obvious
yeah,
as having black skin, obviously,
yeah,
but it it is oftentimes obvious enough so that people will know, and yeah. So, but not just the Turkish. I mean, this is something that you hear from migrants all the time, and
yeah,
I feel a little bit the same way because like I have my friends back in Germany, I have my job and my colleagues here, and there's like this split, and I don't know. Like I haven't been here as long as you have been in England, so it's not a settled thing yet, and it's really difficult to like to even compare these things. Friends, a good job, like how do
yeah.
you measure one against the other, you know?
Against the other, yeah, and it's also like um this. I think in autism we'll be talking more of like masking, like where someone is trying to fit in, and I guess if you are like someone like me will be talking about code switching, where if I'm amongst like my colleagues who are from here and so on, I have to be in take a particular way of
Mm-hmm.
of be of behaving and of dealing with things and of talking,
Mm-hmm.
and then I come back if I have to be amongst people from from my background, I have to switch and then fit in there. And personally, I am somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm constantly, so you're having to switch from one to the other. Obviously, I don't think it's in any way comparable because I guess it's become like part of, you just get used to it. For me, it's just and because I'm not autistic, I wouldn't know like the internalized feeling that people go through when they have to do things like that to try and fit into the world that doesn't necessarily meet their needs or is necessarily designed for them, and everyone is expecting you to just come and fit into it. So I couldn't really say, but I can, from my experience, my personal experience, it can be quite difficult, like having to have your feet in different worlds, trying to go there and fit into that, try to go there and fit
Yeah,
into that.
I definitely find it relatable what you're saying.
Yeah,
Because I mean, in the literature, it's often described, and I feel kind of that this is true, that for autistic people, it's kind of like playing different roles in different settings.
yeah,
And I can totally relate to what you said. Like there'll be social settings that I have where I can speak my mind
Yeah.
very openly, and like if I speak too long on one subject or the ideas get too big, then people will tell me in a way that is perfectly fine. And there's other settings where like kind of castrate myself, or I kind of pre-censor myself not to upset people, or not to go beyond certain borderlines with the way I express myself. Yeah, so yeah, I find it quite relatable what you're saying there. And then let's get to your presentation.
Okay. Yeah.
To the poster that you also presented at the
Yeah.
conference. So what you looked at is when I hope I sum it up right. When there's people working together with different ethnic, cultural backgrounds, that is what you looked at. Like, what is a good match, and where can problems arise? Is that correct, or would you
Yeah.
maybe just say it in your words?
Yeah. So what I looked at is the experiences of like social care workers of delivering what I called cross-cultural support,
Mm-hmm.
like within social care services. So what I was talking about was like if I'm supporting you or you were supporting me, it's because we are from very different backgrounds. How does that work? What are the challenges, and what works well and what doesn't work well? Because what you find is increasingly there is a lot of people that are receiving support, and the people delivering support, they're usually from very different backgrounds. So we wanted to just see what experience, how did the social care workers find that process, and what did they think worked well, and what needed to be changed, and what could help them to do a better job, really. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and so one of the conclusions that I picked up on at the conference was that, contrary to what some people might expect, different cultural backgrounds tend to work better than the same cultural backgrounds.
Yes, so as part of that study, when we looked at it, when we look at sometimes like literature, maybe sometimes from mental health, because they've done quite a bit of work around there, they've always said some of these disparities or difficulties that people face in services is that they are not being supported by people from a similar background from them. That maybe that can be helpful for people to have a better understanding of who they are and what their needs are if they're from the same background. What we actually found from the experiences of these particular group of social care workers was sometimes it was much better if people were from a different background, because then there were no preconceived assumptions. People tended to listen to the individual a lot more, to learn from them what it is exactly that the individual wanted. There were also cultural things around people feeling like if someone from a different culture, because these people were receiving support in their own houses, that some of the people felt like if someone came into their house and they realized that this family had certain problems going on, they're going to tell the rest of the community. Yeah, so their preference was for, as long as you get someone who's willing to learn, who's willing to get to know what our culture is, what we think about, someone who shares probably similar interests rather than a similar background, is probably going to work better. And for many of them, they had, for example, I came across one of the people that I was supporting. She talked of an experience of supporting someone who was from the same background as herself. The mom of this individual was constantly asking her, how come you've reached this age and you're still not married? Why do you dress the way that you dress? And she found herself in a lot, because she was like, my own parents do not care, they do not mind. But I'm going here, I'm coming to work, and I'm being challenged. And she found it quite difficult.
Mhm.
And in some ways, they found themselves sometimes in a dilemma. They want to keep good relations. Sometimes they might be getting on well with the autistic individual, but the family has got all these questions to say, are you setting a good example for our child? You're
Mhm.
going to come here dressed like this. So sometimes there was that idea that, so they came up and said, but what we found to have worked better is I work with someone for a year and my colleague then starts working with them. And my colleague is of a different background. And suddenly my colleague is being told all these things I was never told.
Uh-huh.
Because, yeah, there's that trust that this person is not going to tell anybody else. But I think it always comes down to the relationships that people build, I think, sometimes
Mhm.
as well. Because sometimes it's a lazy, I always call it like a lazy kind of inclusion where we just look at two people and look at them and say, "Oh, you're both Africans, so you should be okay," because that's a very lazy way of looking at people.
Yeah, I
Because
mean, obviously, every African understands themselves well with other Africans. I mean, just take one look at Africa, it becomes obvious, like they're all happy
you know,
together.
you put us two Zimbabweans, we will probably not agree on one thing. So I think it's always I've always people that I've always worked with, services I've always managed. My one thing has always been to get to know the individual.
Hmm.
I think that's the most important thing. Not to work on pre-assumptions for us to immediately assume. Ask the person what it is that they really what they want, and we take it from there. I think sometimes we don't necessarily do enough of that.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's we do things, we try and do some things which are more convenient. Because in UK, a lot of our services, we talk about person-centered planning.
Hmm.
But because it's talked about so often, sometimes it's just become like a mantra that people use.
Yeah.
Because it's person-centered and it's about people's choices, but the choices are very narrow.
Hmm.
We've got these choices that we've put for you that are kind of narrow. And it's almost like a tick box. Sometimes it can become a tick box exercise within these services.
Hmm.
And so I just think to have that curiosity, that professional curiosity, that desire to learn. And so that's why I've always thought to myself, you can be trained. And you might think, let's say, particularly when I talk about autism, you might be trained and you think, oh, I know a bit of, I know about, but until, the whole thing of if you've met one person who's autistic, you've only met one autistic person. You need to get to know each individual, then that's when things start going on. And
Yeah,
we don't always do that.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm autistic myself,
Yeah.
and still I get like sometimes I'll be making assumptions about them. I should know better,
Yeah.
but I just don't see it. And then like recently, a boy came into our school, and I think it has to do with the fact that the way he presents right now,
Yeah.
he has issues that I have overcome.
Okay. Yeah.
So seeing someone having these issues, not yet being able to overcome them, is challenging in a different way, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because it subconsciously takes you back to a place where you were a lot, let's say, weaker or less self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And when it was a bit of a challenge, so I had to get used to that. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of sum up what you said so far. So I kind of see three problem areas that might arise when people of the same background come together. One thing you mentioned is that the social worker might make assumptions because they think, I know this background, so I kind of know about this person, and might oversee things that if they didn't know about the background, they might be coming in with a different attitude.
Yes.
And then there's the problem that, and I would infer, correct me if I'm wrong, that in the African or maybe in the Arab Muslim community or like in the Indian community, that those are probably communities where this is especially a thing, where like the client might be afraid that the social worker is so connected in the community that their secrets might not be safe with that person.
Yes. So certain cultures where people what you'd probably where there's a very strong sense of community,
Mm-hmm.
more like interdependence. People might feel like, yes, if I tell something to someone, this might end up being told to people within my community. Yes.
And then there's the third issue that might arise, that a social worker of a certain background might meet expectations from the family of the client that might be difficult for them to deal with or might compromise their work.
Yes. So, yes, I think that you've summed that very well, even better than I said. Yes. So expectations from the social care worker, from the family, might actually clash with their role that they're supposed to play. So they've got certain expectations of them because they are from a similar background.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like, yeah, you're one of us, why don't you? Why are you not willing to do this? You know where we are coming from with this. So it's almost like an ethical. We found that a lot of them found themselves sometimes in an ethical dilemma where there were expectations of them that set outside of what their professional role was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there's this thing that you mentioned that I wanted to talk about, the person approach.
Person-centered approach.
Person-centered approach. So one thing I came across at the Dublin conference that I really liked was the Middleton Centre for Autism. They explained their work, and they had these 10-month interventions where they don't just focus on the person, but they focus on the whole family unit. And I really like that for several reasons. You have family units where you have, for instance, one autistic child and one non-autistic child.
Yes.
Or just in general, you have one child with a handicap and one child without a handicap. And in such a family unit, there's a tendency for the child with a disability to obviously have way more attention because they might need more attention. So the child without a disability might also have issues. So looking at the whole family unit makes a lot of sense. Also, I think it's really important to work with the parents as well. Especially here, working with school-age children. The parents are so important. Like, there are certain situations where we're trying to work on a certain behavior with the child. And if that's not also happening at home, if the adults aren't one team, then it can be really difficult to make those changes. And so I thought that family unit centered approach, I really like that. And I was wondering, how is that in England?
So I can only speak from, because I work in adult services, and part of the presentation that I did at Autism Europe, one of the things that the social care workers came up with was it was very important to build a good relationship with the family and to also work alongside the family for a lot of the people that they were supporting in order for anything to be successful. And I think what we find sometimes is if you deal with issues that are affecting the whole that are affecting the whole family, it can then help whoever you're working with get better outcomes. And so yes, a family focused like approach can be really good, yeah. But I think it's very dependent sometimes because you can also with adults, because like I said, my background, my work is really with adults. Sometimes we come across where what the individual wants for themselves and what the parents want for the individuals, that can, yeah, that might not match.
Yeah,
And
also a
so
problem I
sometimes,
can very much relate to.
and for our social care workers, sometimes that can be quite a challenging
Yeah,
situation. They see the
definitely.
value of the parents being in that person's life and being there and being supported. Because when people move, because what we do is we provide like accommodation, which is independent, and we support people initially to develop their skills and to be able then to live by themselves in that accommodation. Sometimes we find that if someone has got family involved, that stops sometimes some of the isolation that can come with that and some of the difficulties. But sometimes like I said, the goals can be different. What the parents are looking for, what the individual wants. Staff might think to themselves, but they would benefit from having their parents there. But I don't think it's our place to kind of, that's the dilemma they sometimes face because parents have got totally different ideas sometimes. I think a perfect example is we were supporting someone and this person had gone through a very difficult time, their mental health and everything else. So when they came out from hospital, we started supporting them and they moved into their own accommodation, into their own property, settled down, got involved in volunteering and other things. And the next stage that they were looking for was to move on now, away from this accommodation that had support into their own accommodation, which we had already found. And we're starting the process of like transitioning then out into their own accommodation. It's at that point the mom decided that it was time for him to go overseas and find a wife. And it's not something that we, as a service, we think, yeah, okay, down the line, if that's what you want to do and is in agreement with it. But at the moment, we're still very much at the early stages of his next stage. Let him settle where he's moving, then all these things will follow on. But the mom's priority was very different. When initially we're talking, he was like, not sure. He was like, I'm not sure I'm ready for this. But I believe because that's what his family wanted, he eventually just said, yeah, I'm going to go then. That's something I'm going to do. And
that must be especially difficult for him if he settled in the UK with a support network and then he has to go back.
So the idea was for him to go back, get married, and then come back here. And then the wife eventually joins him.
Yeah. But was he familiar with his home country? Was it a place that he was
because he was born.
regularly?
I think he was born here and he had only ever gone once in a while, but not really. I wouldn't say he was truly familiar with it. I mean, from our point of view, for what it's worth, we kind of thought, or maybe this is not a great idea. But what then happened was there's something like almost like a meeting where you've got social workers, you've got a psychologist, and almost like a special interests meeting to see if it's in his best interest, special interest, best interest, to see if it was in his best interest, if he understood this idea of him going there. But he clearly understood what that entailed. And that's part of what we are supposed to do, is to respect someone's choices. But I guess from a service point of view, it was almost like the people who were supporting him felt maybe a few months down the line, if they've been much better. Because that's too many changes at the same time. He's about to move from a place he's lived for 2 years he's going to go and get married. There's just too many things happening at the same time. He's just found stability after a while.
Mhm.
Maybe let us let it all settle down before he does the next thing. But yeah, those are some of the challenges sometimes you come across. And so it's important that parents are involved, but whether the social care workers are always able to handle when such situations arise was one of the questions we asked, because talking to them, they were still very passionate about that situation. They felt like maybe it could have been handled a bit differently, or maybe it could have been, yeah. So they were finding such almost like ethical challenges that they were having to sort of find solutions for themselves. And the service didn't necessarily have, could I say, policies or guidance as to what do they do in those kind of
Mhm.
situations. So they were having to find solutions by themselves as they were working, the people we talked to, yeah.
Very interesting situation. Did he eventually go?
He did. He did.
And
But because once he left, because what he then did was to give notice to say, okay, I'm now leaving this property, I'm going
Mhm.
away. We haven't had any much contact with him since then, because then he
that's
had
that's the
them.
part about the work that we do that I really dislike. Like
Yeah,
tomorrow, a parent of a child that goes to the school might decide they're gonna move away,
yeah,
and then you don't ever see that child again. You don't know what happens to them. That can
yeah.
be a bit frustrating at times.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. But I guess it's just trying to find a way to think to yourself, I hope the work that I've done has made a lasting impact, hopefully.
Yeah.
And yeah,
There's something which I call the foreigner effect, and I wonder what you think of this. So, I've made the experience when you have autism and you go to a foreign country, um, the usual problems that you have might go away because when you are a foreigner, people don't expect you to act according to the norms of their country, you know?
yeah,
And so if you're an autistic person, you're a bit social awkward, but no one expects you to act just like they would or within the corridor of their expectations, then that can be a quite freeing experience for autistic people. So maybe your client got lucky
yeah. I hope
with
so.
how it worked out for him.
That's a very interesting. That's a very interesting theory. I'd never really looked at it that way. So thank you for that. I hadn't thought of it in that way. Yeah, because there's the expectation. People are not putting those expectations on you because they don't expect you to behave according to their norms.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, no. I hope he experienced that. That would be really good. Yeah.
Um, okay, and so I would assume that the situation of Black autistic people is maybe like would it be correct to call it a special field of interest for you?
So yes, so my interest really is on the intersection of autism with ethnicity and
Mm-hmm.
culture, race, that kind of thing. And but my particular focus is Black autistic adults, particularly from an African background.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my focus for my PhD. Yes.
Okay. So give us some insights into that. What are the special challenges that people at this particular intersection face?
So I think what we find, there isn't a lot of work that's been done.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, there isn't a lot of research that is around Black autistic adults. there is not a lot of research that centers their voices and their lived experiences.
Mm-hmm.
That is still, that there is not a lot of it. We are seeing an emerging body of literature, particularly from first-person accounts and what people are talking about. And what we are seeing, a lot of kind of sometimes follows what we see, let's say, in mental health and in health, where a lot of like Black adults are facing a lot of inequalities in terms of they've got worse health outcomes, they are not well served by services, and they are
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily, they're sometimes underemployed at a higher rate than their peers. And we are seeing that as well when we look at these first person accounts, that this is what's also happening with autistic adults. But there isn't yet that big body of literature around that. Definitely not from the UK. Maybe America is slightly ahead in terms of that kind of work. So for me, it's just an interest to try and look at contributing a bit more towards that conversation. But as I said, for my interest really, as always, is guided by making the services that we provide a lot better, to make the experiences of the people a lot better as well. So if I look at the services that we provide, looking at the UK population, and I would assume you would expect the services to be utilized at sort of like similar way to, in almost like if there's 20%, let's say if in this country there's maybe 5% Black people, would at least expect somewhere towards that number maybe in the services. But in autism services, in the services I work in, that's definitely not the situation with learning disabilities and autism. A lot of people do not access the services.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it is to look at, is it because the services are not meeting their needs? Or are there other sources of support that they've got that are outside of these services? What I
Would you
get,
say that Black people tend to be more suspect of services that come from the state?
in mental health, from what we see in mental health, there's been a history of maybe sometimes people experiencing, if we're to be quite honest, like racism. They probably get worst, the diagnosis they get are usually for the most, if I could call them, most stigmatizing diagnosis. They are
Mm-hmm.
more likely to be compulsorily detained in mental health services.
Mm-hmm.
They are also more likely, so their experiences tend to be quite negative. And once people have had negative experiences, you become quite suspicious of services.
Oh yeah.
We've had quite some high profile cases sometimes where people have died whilst within these services where they're supposed to be safe, because restraint was used and not used correctly. So
Mm-hmm.
people find themselves that restraint is used more often than not on people from these backgrounds. So you get that whole thing of, do you then trust? There's also sometimes a cultural element to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if we come to, let's say, autism or disability, we are very much sometimes in the West, it can be seen, it can be an identity to say, I'm autistic.
Mm-hmm.
I am, along those lines. But sometimes in some cultures, definitely in a culture like mine, people will find it very strange for someone to identify them according to what they see as, I don't know what's the best way to use, like to identify themselves with it by a disability, by
Mm-hmm.
something that makes them different.
Mm-hmm.
That will be very strange, because normally once something is named in that way, it starts creating a sort of like division. It sort of like puts you outside of the group, because that now makes you, in a sense, a bit different. So there's a number of authors who look at this and say, identity-first language probably works well in the West, but might not necessarily work well in certain cultures because
Okay.
they do. Yeah.
Let's try to put that aspect back a little bit because I want to ask you especially about that.
Yeah.
So about the things you just said, one thing I can relate to is, so I have made really bad experiences with psychotherapy and psychologists,
Yeah.
and I cannot trust them at all anymore. Like, I would probably need psychotherapy just to be able to access psychotherapy again. So, when I was younger, I was in a mental health clinic for 3 months where they thought I was schizophrenic and
Okay.
treated me with very severe medication. And that was a very profound experience for me, very dark. And I just cannot trust these kinds of people anymore. Like, I I rationally understand that they could probably help me with some of the trauma that I gathered back then, but on an emotional level, I can just not trust these people. Like, I once ran into a doctor, and he kind of looked like the doctor that treated me back in that clinic. And like, I eventually got over myself and was able to continue with that other doctor. But the first time I had a serious conversation with him and came home afterwards, like, I had all sorts of emotions within me. I was really in a dark place because that just triggered memories. Um, then the other thing that I want to talk about is I can seem intense to other people due to my autism. And some people are afraid of me because of that. I make them uncomfortable. I make them feel uneasy. And I wonder, I'm thinking that if you are a black male and autistic, then that is probably even more severe. When we look at, I mean, the main focus of Black Lives Matter when they came up was exactly the whole thing of how a black person might appear, or there might just be the prejudice that black people are more violent. They might have a certain appearance. They might be bigger than the average white person. Things like that, like aspects to being black that might be intimidating to non-black people. And I'm thinking, like, if you mix that with a person that might not fully understand the social situation that they're in, or you mix that with a person that has a meltdown, I would assume that for a black male autistic person to have a meltdown in public, it could probably be a health hazard. I mean, besides the
Yeah.
discomfort of the meltdown itself, but just because of the attention that you
Yes,
call to yourself.
I think there've been documented cases in America. I know I've seen some documented in America where such situations have led to police encounters that have ended in a very negative way because of these misconceptions that people have got about how like how black people come across, and then if someone is autistic, and you start thinking, because there's sometimes just reading from what particularly what American colleagues sometimes talk about, and they say sometimes they have to, when they've got a young black man and they're raising them. I hear this from some people sometimes in the UK. They have to teach these young men how to the way that they should come across in public so that they don't create a certain impression of themselves, because there are these stereotypes that are already out there. And if I can imagine then if it's a young autistic person who's already trying to fit in to this world, and there's that added layer of you are likely to also face additional attention, and you then have to manage this as well. I think it can be quite difficult. But yeah, I've seen the information, things like that documented, particularly in America, that when someone shows certain traits in public or certain things, like has a meltdown or something, that has not ended in a positive way. And that's an additional thing. And I think sometimes that's when, because sometimes people ask and say, autism is autism. Why are we dividing it into looking at certain particular groups? Why are you researching Black autistic adults? Life is, as it is difficult. We need the world to be better for autistic people. And it's true. But there's also a certain subsection that are experiencing things that the rest of the other autistic people are not necessarily experiencing. So like when you're talking about these Black autistic adults, that's something that needs to be looked at, but it's not necessarily doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. But I just think when we have research like that, which looks at every part of the autistic community, of the autistic population, it enriches the research that we're doing. It helps the knowledge become much broader and much more helpful, because out there might be someone else who might get into that situation as well. And because the work has been done before, they don't need to go through the same things as well. And so, because I get questioned a lot and say, why particularly? But then it's just because there's just certain situations, certain needs that do not apply across to everyone. And they have not necessarily been looked at by as much. And it's just a way of just expanding our knowledge base as well.
Well, I can definitely relate to that. Because like I have two hearts in my chest. And one is like usually when I meet an autistic person, be they, for instance, a woman or a Black male or whatever, I feel like their autism makes me connect to them more than them being a woman or them being a Black person differentiates them from me, you know? But then, like, especially with the women in autism thing, I mean that's a big subject at the moment. There's a lot of things happening, and like one part of me is like, yeah, should we really split up autistic people into more groups, because that'll make it even more complicated. But then the other part of me is like, obviously there are experiences that women have that men don't have, or that a Black person might have that a white person might not. And of course we need to explore these and talk about these. But yeah, I can definitely relate to that. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there's definitely things that particular groups experience that others don't, and that might be amplified by autism, and it might play a particular role. So yeah, I can relate to that. And then you already got a bit into that, and there was the part where you talked about let's say the African view at autism. And I mean, you're from Zimbabwe, so of course Zimbabwe is not all of Africa, but yeah, I'd be really interested in some cultural attitudes from that place.
Okay, maybe let me just kind of explain that a bit better.
Yeah.
So, for example, let's say if we look at something like maybe hip hop and that whole that is more like an American thing.
Okay.
So I think that's why sometimes when we're starting to do these studies, we first looked at just Black autistic adults and say, oh, but Black is very wide and there's very different things. And then we said Black Africans and said Africa is very wide. So my actual research particularly focuses on Nigerian and Ghanaian Black autistic adults, because Ghanaians and Nigerians are the majority of Black people in the UK. So just to clarify, when I say like we tend not to identify, people would find it difficult to identify as a disability as their identity. It's not necessarily around it. It's not about status or in something like that.
Okay.
So if we looked at somewhere like the kind of culture I come from, every person has got a role within the culture. Everyone's got a role wherever you are. And everyone, it's almost like there's something called this Ubuntu,
Ubuntu?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
explain the word again. Like some people might know what it means because of the Linux distribution, but explain the word.
It's probably like, we usually talk about I am because you are. You're like one community. A person is a person because of other people. Umuntu ngabantu. So me being here is because of the community I have, the family, the rest of my community. They've come together and they've helped to raise me. Almost like it takes a village to raise a child. It's a communal responsibility. So whilst someone who's like autistic in this country, they might look at them and say, because they look at things differently and they do things differently. In my culture, they would not necessarily have to give that person a label. They would just look at it as this is someone else who prefers to do things in a different way. And this is their place and this is what they do. They do not have to name it because people have got different roles to play. So almost, I get asked a lot sometimes to say, when we're back home, why is it that as soon as we come here, our children sometimes are getting diagnoses for different things? They didn't have a diagnosis back home. But there is an intuitive thing that the whole community knows this person likes things a certain way and likes things to be done a different way and behaves in a different way. And what if we were to call the traits do not become so obvious because the community accommodates them.
That's very interesting.
So a lot of times they will say to you, like, the idea of like disability and giving names to that is a legacy of colonialism for people in Africa. They didn't have this whole thing of, if someone is developing in a different way, they need to be isolated from everyone else and need to have a special place they go to. So what we are finding out is it's something that came later on. It isn't something that is inherent in our cultures.
So would it be the same with physical disability? So let's say someone lost a leg, and then it would be natural for the village or the community that he's part of to accommodate for that?
Yeah, to look after someone, yes, they would probably. I think where you start having now it's not like a perfect system as it were, but if someone had probably profound and multiple disabilities, then that becomes a totally different thing, because that's someone who is, that might not necessarily work in quite the same way. But for most of the times, there isn't that sense of, so those are the people you are likely to find being labeled. Someone with more profound and multiple disabilities, that's where the label probably goes. So almost like where it's so obvious that someone has got a disability and is not able to really contribute as much as, but it isn't, there is less of even when it's like that, there is that responsibility, because we don't necessarily have the services. It's not, maybe in certain places you might find services, but there isn't as much, like social care and so on doesn't necessarily exist. And a lot of times it can be up to the family to look after someone. Maybe in the city,
but it
not having
makes
that.
in the way you're describing it, it makes sense that there's less need for social care work if
Yeah.
if the community is willing to engage with certain problems like that, then
Yes.
but
Yeah. So
I I suppose there's probably conditions that are so heavy or so care intense that they well that they don't work in this kind of system.
yes, that's why I say like then there is certain situations where you do get. So what you're likely to get, excuse me. So if you went to a place like Zimbabwe,
Mm-hmm.
uh, certain places in Africa, someone who's called autistic is likely to be someone who's also got profound and multiple disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So once someone gets to the point where they need 24-hour care or they need intensive support,
Mm-hmm.
that's where probably then the label will probably be put in there. A
Mm-hmm.
few a few years ago, my supervisors and I met with people they were from another country, which I'm not going to say, but and we were having this knowledge exchange around autism.
Mm-hmm.
One of them said to us, your autism in the UK looks very different from the autism where we come from.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was they only had ever come across the someone being called autistic when they needed like intense support.
Mm-hmm.
They never come across someone described as autistic and they're probably going to work or going to school or just needing minimal support. That's
Mm-hmm.
something that they not come across. And so to them, they were like, so the best way she could express it was your autism is different from our autism, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in a society from where I come from, as long as someone is able to contribute to the greater group, to the community, they're seen as capable and not necessarily going to be seen as having
Mm-hmm.
any level of a disability.
Okay,
Yes.
so me being an ignorant white European, I have this romantic idea about shamanism and like there's certain people who in the white West would have it difficult, like a schizophrenic, certain forms of being very fluid about your gender. And it seems that in some African cultures, there's a place for these people being, like, for instance, in a shaman position, like a spiritual advisor, someone who can see things that might not be obvious to others. It like is that an over romanticization? Is that kind of true, or like?
Yeah, I think I've come across where people have written about this
Mm-hmm.
quite recently, where people have said necessarily, let's say hearing voices is not necessarily, in some cultures, is not always seen as a negative thing.
Mm-hmm.
As you're saying that someone could be then hearing, those could be spiritual and they could be telling them something that's different. I've heard people saying that. But from personal experience, I haven't necessarily delved too deeply into that
Mm-hmm.
about shamanism and all that. I do not necessarily know. Um, so it's something that I probably need to be to look a bit more into as to how that works, maybe from my own culture. But I haven't really. I know there is people who are seen as being spiritual and they can hear voices and they can see things and they can.
Mm-hmm.
But as to the connection with, let's say, mental health and other things, it's not something I have necessarily delved into. But I've read other people talking about it from other cultures, but it's not something I've necessarily gone into. Very,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. That was really interesting. So one question I like to ask people at the end: what is autism to you?
Ooh. Now that's a loaded question.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we use the term constantly, but so far, everyone that I asked had something very different to say about what the word means to them. So
I think
don't
I
be
think
shy.
for,
You can't say give a wrong answer.
no, I think for me it's a way of being. It's just someone's own way. It's a way of being. It's a different. Sometimes it's different from how people are. I think sometimes we like talking about great minds think alike, but
Mm-hmm.
I've become such a having been doing this for a while. I've come to the conclusion that great minds do not think alike, and that is there's room for the minds that see things in a very different way and do
Mm-hmm.
things in a different and much to their own beat. So I think it's something that adds diversity to this world that we live in, and the world sometimes is better for people who add this diversity to the way that we think and view things. I don't know if that defines it, but that's you caught me unawares. Just what I have in my head.
Any answer is a good answer.
Yeah.
Don't have any particular thing in mind.
Yeah.
So you would probably say that great minds think in a very particular way.
No, great minds don't think alike.
Yeah, but they
In
have
different
they have a
ways.
very particular like that person thinks in that way, and that is why they are considered a great thinker, and it's a very individual approach.
Yeah, it's a very individual approach here.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to all see things the same way. We look at something and each one comes up with their own conclusion, and that's okay. And that
Mm-hmm.
we need more of that, I think. This world would be so much better if we're more accepting of people's who see things differently from us. I think it's a
Oh
great
yeah,
thing.
and that is
Yeah.
like there's a lot of talk about the neurodiversity movement right now. And if the outcome of it were that, just like with the homosexuality movement, if the outcome were that more people understand that they're just just like they did with the sexuality, they began to understand there's different ways. It doesn't always have to be a man and a woman. There's room for more. And if the same thing happened, like there's different ways of thinking, there's different ways of processing the world. If that were the outcome, yeah, that'd be great. That would help a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah, true. That's very true.
All right. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. It was really interesting, your perspectives.
And thank you, Fabian. This has been very interesting, and you've left me with a lot of food for thought and other things that I
That's
need to be
nice. That's
looking
nice.
at.
I like
Yeah.
to do that to people.
So thank you.
All right.